Hey, welcome back as we continue in our series called Spiritual Rhythms, where we are going to explore another rhythm this week that opens us up to the loving presence of God in our everyday lives. This week, we look at the rhythm of reading scripture in a culture of competing stories. Humans are drawn to stories. One author says we are addicted to stories. And psychologists note that humans are drawn to stories because they make sense of the world we live in, the chaotic and broken world that we live in. All of us live by a story, some narrative that helps make sense of the world. Who are we? Where are we going? What is the meaning or purpose of life? Stories help fill in some of those blanks. They make sense of a broken world. They're kind of like a lens that we view the world through. Some people will say a worldview is really just a story. And the neuroscience of the brain on story is so fascinating. Our brain looks less like a spectator and more like a participant when we experience or hear or are part of story. When someone gets sad in a movie, we feel sadness. We resonate. We start to feel what we're experiencing, even though we know it might just be totally fake. Research has been showing now for decades that stories shape our beliefs, our behaviors, and our attitudes toward the world. They draw us into the experience. Think about a kid who watches a Marvel movie like the Avengers or something for the first time. They immediately want, the Iron Man suit or the Captain America shield. Or, someone who watches Star Wars and they want the plastic lightsaber. Why? Because they're drawn into the story. They want to feel part of it. They want to feel connected to those characters and that plot and that story. How many of your friends or family have gotten sucked in the last year to the divisive and polarizing U.S. political narrative that has been happening, the drama that has unfolded over the last 4 or 5 years especially? As much as we Canadians like to gloat that that's not our deal and it's not our country, whatever, we get drawn into that narrative, that drama, and we participate in it, and before we know it, we have, staked our camp in one particular place with one particular story, like so many other people, because stories help make sense of a chaotic world. If so-and-so wins the election, things will start getting better. If I finally get into that single-family home, life will, start to turn around for me. If, the Maple Leafs get better goaltending, they'll finally win a Stanley Cup again. Like, all of these things help make sense of the world we live in. Stories help make sense of that. It's in part why there's so many conspiracy theories lately, because conspiracy theories tell an alternative story to the one that we typically hear in news or media. It's also why we love country music. It's so popular, even though it's musically actually quite simple, because they tell a story. Country music is like this art of storytelling, typically around a guy with a jacked up truck and a girl who breaks his heart. Somehow that story is so compelling to us, we will listen to it 1,000 times from 1,000 different artists with very similar music and very similar lyrics. We love stories. When we get together with people, most of the time we tell stories about our lives, about work, about other people. This is why we are so often prone to gossip as well, because we like telling stories about other people. What does this have to do with spiritual rhythms? Well, more than ever, and I mean that, more than ever today, we are being formed and shaped by the stories around us, the stories within our culture about God, about our world, about what it means to be human. Through ads, social media, the digital algorithms that kind of push us into a particular corner, we see somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 ads every single day, and they tell a particular story, each one of them. They form our beliefs, our attitudes, and our behavior. And the question for us is not whether or not we will live by a particular story. That answer is yes, we all do. The question for us is, what story will we choose to live by? And the rhythm of reading scripture is a rhythm that is about forming us through the true story of God, humanity, and our world. I'm aware many people have a lot of questions, maybe even a lot of baggage about Scripture and the Bible and what it means. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to discuss every one of those questions and how to read it and how not to read it and how to interpret it and what it all means. We will discuss a couple of ways to read it, but more importantly, I think for us, specifically in our spiritual formation, is two things. What we understand the Bible to be primarily, and how we approach it, or our posture. Often in our Protestant traditions, we approach Scripture as something, as kind of a rule book or almost like an encyclopedia, a work of information that we can study and dissect and analyze and ultimately kind of master. We see Scripture as kind of a reference guide, and often the Bible becomes an object for us to dissect and study. And we read it for information and knowledge. And that's not all bad, but there is a problem with that approach. You can have all sorts of biblical knowledge, Bible knowledge, but live by an entirely different story. We can actually be shaped by the cultural narratives, the stories that we hear and experience and are formed by every single day. And the temptation for us is then to go to Scripture and find a verse, usually a verse taken out of context, to support that particular ideology or story that we've lived by or that we've bought into. The extremes of this are, the Crusades or slavery. Maybe closer to home for us today is kind of like Christian nationalism, where we can find verses to support pretty much anything and everything as we find a specific verse taken out of context and allow it to justify the narrative, the story we live by. Without realizing it, our understanding of Scripture can be shaped more by the cultural stories and narratives around us rather than Scripture being the thing that informs and shapes how we see and engage with culture. We need to see Scripture not as a reference guide to master, but rather a story that we live by, a story we participate in. It's a collection of books, 66 in fact, from a number of different authors in different genres over a number of years that tell primarily one unified story that leads us to Jesus. It's not written to prove our scientific theories correct, nor is it simply a human handbook of rules. It is a story, and I would argue a true story of God, humanity, and our world that ultimately points us to the person of Jesus. The root word for Scripture is obviously script. A.J. Sherrill has this great quote. He says, "The Bible intends to script or story us amid surrounding cultural scripts that are vying for our allegiance and our affection." It's the story we have to be formed by and immersed in first about God, humanity, and our world. Otherwise, Instagram influencers and popular culture will fill that role for you. Rather than approach Scripture as something to master or just dissect, and I love studying theology, I love Scripture, I love that aspect of it, we need to approach Scripture as something to form us, as a story we participate in, as a drama that we get entered into as we read it. A.J. Sherrill, again, he says, "I believe the central purpose of Scripture is not first to indoctrinate with theological propositions meant simply to reside in our heads. Rather, the Bible's central purpose is to invite us to participate in the unfolding of God's drama in the world." I love that. Despite all of the baggage and maybe even some of the questions, which are totally legitimate, I have my own. Despite all of those questions we might have about Scripture, it has and always will play a central role for followers of Jesus in their own spiritual formation, because the Bible is a story that points us to the person of Jesus. Somehow through these particular words and this particular story, we encounter Jesus, the living God. We are formed into his image as we read it and enter into this drama. There's two particular ways of reading Scripture that we're going to explore this week that help us do this, that help us kind of get out of this mindset of just analyzing and maybe even studying and maybe even just learning about theology and learning about the Bible, and rather kind of transport us into the narrative of Scripture. The first is to read large chunks of Scripture in one sitting. So instead of just reading, one chapter or one kind of half chapter that has, very little context before or after, and just kind of, slowly reading through that, we want to read large chunks of Scripture. In fact, this was for centuries, almost for all of human history, the primary way Christians engaged with Scripture, was reading it out loud, typically in large sections. If you think about some of the Apostle Paul's letters from the New Testament, Galatians or Ephesians, those would have been read out loud to the church in one sitting. One person would have read it all the way through. And it helps us kind of get into the narrative rather than just thinking, how can I apply this text, or what is the sort of moral lesson that I can, apply to my life? The question it helps us ask is, what's going on in the story, right? What's happening in the book of Acts? What's happening in the book of 1 Kings? What's going on in the prophets? What's happening in the story of Jesus? It helps us get this bigger, kind of wider view of the larger narrative of Scripture as we follow characters like Moses and Abraham and David and Jesus and Paul and Timothy and all of these amazing characters from Scripture. Reading large chunks of Scripture invites us into that story. It immerses us into what was happening at that time. It's not about mastering the text. It's not about memorizing it or finding principles that just kind of apply to our life. It's about immersing ourselves into one chapter, one piece of a larger story. Secondly, and this is more of an ancient rhythm, is the rhythm of Lectio Divina, which is really just a fancy Latin way of saying divine reading. The emphasis here on this way of reading Scripture and engaging with it is on specifically meeting with God through the text. That is the primary purpose. Again, it's less of an information acquisition mode of reading Scripture. It's more about encountering the living God through these very specific words. Most people there's kind of 5 movements to this, and most people will read through a text. Maybe it's a psalm, maybe it's a story from the gospel, very slowly, not rushing, not quickly going through, but slowly allowing the words to kind of sink in. Read a short text. It doesn't have to be long. Read it slowly, carefully, and just allow the words to kind of hit you. You're not trying to analyze them. You're not trying to figure out what it all means. You're just allowing yourself to engage with these specific words. You read through it once and you pay attention. Is there a word that stands out? Is there a phrase that stands out? Maybe a couple of words from the text. Is there an image that comes to your mind? When people read, say, a gospel account, they'll picture themselves in the story. So if Jesus is teaching, they'll picture themselves on the hillside as Jesus teaches. You have that image in mind as you read through it. You pay attention. Is there a word that stands out? Is there a phrase from the text that jumps to your mind? Kind of read it through once, very slowly, paying attention to what stands out in your mind. After a minute or two of reflection, you read it again, and in our groups, we'll have someone else read it again. Again, slowly, carefully, allowing the words to kind of sink into your soul, connect with you personally. What word or phrase stands out to you as you hear or read this particular Scripture? After your second reading, with either a word or phrase or an image in mind, you respond to God. You just talk to God about your experience. God, what does this mean for me today? God, what are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to speak to me through this word, through this phrase, through this image? What is it that you're trying to communicate? You talk to God, you bring him in and experience and relate to him, respond to him through what you've read. You can read it again if you need to, but the idea here is not, again, to study. It's more to engage with God, to encounter him through the specific Scripture you're reading. And lastly, you just kind of rest in God's presence. As God speaks to you, as God maybe highlights something in your mind, you just allow that to sink in. You rest in his presence before you go on into your day. You will notice as you do this practice that throughout the day, that word or that image or that thought will come to mind again. It's almost like it continues to speak to you throughout the day. God continues to remind you of what he spoke to you in the morning or at night or whatever it was as you go about your day. This may be a new practice for some of you, but it is actually one of the most ancient and well-versed practices for Christians for many, many centuries. It's one of the primary ways followers of Jesus have engaged in reading Scripture. So, To recap, this week we explore the rhythm of reading Scripture primarily in two ways. Large chunks in one sitting, which we're hopefully going to do once this week, as well as Lectio Divina, the slower, meditative, reflective reading, to be formed by the true story of God, humanity, and our world, the narrative that gives meaning and purpose to our everyday lives, not the many competing stories that we hear and experience and are formed by through the culture and the world around us, whether it's politics or consumerism or government or media, whatever the thing that is happening today in culture. We have to be immersed and formed by the true story of what's happening in our world. This is our story. As we engage in it, we are drawn into it, not as spectators, but as participants, as people who live by this story, this narrative. As always, there's more on our PDF guide about where to begin, as well as some passages you might want to read this week in large chunks, as well as our Lectio Divina practice. Use this if it's helpful as a way to remember some of the steps of Lectio Divina. There's kind of 5 simple steps. It can take you 10 minutes, it can take you 15 minutes as you work through a psalm or a story in the gospel, and as you prepare to meet God this week. And so we will gather again next week. Happy reading as you engage with God through Scripture this week.